I wasn't looking for proof that our cities are built on lies. I was researching foundation repair techniques for a client's historic building downtown, trying to understand why so many old structures develop identical stress fractures at nearly identical depths. Standard engineering work, nothing strange about it. Then I found the photographs, images from municipal archives, construction records from the 1880s and 90s, street-level documentation that showed something impossible. Buildings standing at ground level in 1887, then photographed again in 1902 with their first floors completely underground. Not subsidence, not settling. The streets had risen 3, sometimes 4 meters in 15 years, and nobody thought to mention it. The official explanation blames sanitation projects. Cities raised their streets to improve drainage, install sewer systems, combat flooding, reasonable enough until you examine what got buried. These weren't simple wooden structures or rough frontier buildings. They were architectural masterworks, granite facades with hand-carved details, arched windows with imported glass, ornamental ironwork that would cost millions to reproduce today. All of it engineered and installed specifically to face what? Dirt? Sewage? The underside of wooden sidewalks? That makes no sense. You don't hire master stonemasons to carve elaborate details on basement windows. You don't import Italian marble for drainage tunnels. You don't build grand archways designed to welcome visitors into spaces that will be filled with earth before the mortar fully cures, unless those spaces weren't supposed to be underground. Unless something else happened that nobody wants to discuss. Look at Seattle's underground. Everyone knows it exists. Tour guides walk visitors through buried storefronts and sealed-off sidewalks beneath Pioneer Square. The standard story claims the Great Fire of 1889 destroyed the original city, and during reconstruction, officials decided to raise the street level. Simple urban planning. Except the buildings that burned were mostly wood. The structures buried beneath current street level are stone and brick, featuring construction techniques that supposedly didn't exist in Seattle until a decade later. The timeline fractures when you examine it closely. Chicago tells a similar story. Miles of tunnels connect buried first floors beneath downtown streets. Official records credit street-raising projects in the 1850s and 60s with creating this underground network. But photographs from the period show buildings already standing at their current heights before the supposed street-raising began. The documentation contradicts the physical evidence, and nobody seems concerned about the discrepancy. Portland has its Shanghai tunnels, Edinburgh has Mary King's Close, Rome has multiple cities stacked vertically. Every explanation treats these as isolated local phenomena, quirks of individual urban development. But step back. Look at the pattern globally. Cities across continents, supposedly developing independently, all show identical architectural signatures. Ground-level windows buried 3 meters down, ornate stonework cut off at sidewalk level, structural systems engineered for a ground plane that no longer exists. The precision is what haunts me. These aren't gradual accumulations of urban debris slowly covering ancient structures over centuries. These are sophisticated buildings from the 1800s, buried within decades of construction by several meters of fill material. The geology itself is strange, not compressed urban waste gradually building up. Clean fill, sand, clay, material that looks deposited rapidly, not accumulated slowly. I started mapping it. Every city I could find with documented buried architecture. The dates they were supposedly built, the dates they were supposedly buried, the official explanations for why, and a pattern emerged that conventional urban history cannot explain. Between roughly 1870 and 1910, cities worldwide underwent nearly identical transformations. Streets rose, first floors became basements, architectural details disappeared underground, and the documentation explaining how and why this happened is either missing, vague, or contradictory. The engineering records are the strangest gap. For projects supposedly requiring massive infrastructure investment, coordinated municipal planning, years of construction work affecting entire city centres, the paper trail is remarkably thin. No comprehensive cost analyses, no detailed engineering surveys, no contemporary newspaper coverage proportional to the scale of work described. It's as if the documentation was created afterward, reverse engineered to explain changes that had already occurred for reasons nobody wanted to record. And then there's the architecture itself. The buried structures show construction sophistication that shouldn't exist in their supposed era. Load-bearing calculations that require mathematical principles not formalized until later. Acoustic engineering in buried performance spaces that rivals modern concert halls. Heating systems with centralized distribution networks, appearing in buildings dated decades before such technology was supposedly invented. Stonework with joints tighter than hand tools should achieve, proportions following mathematical ratios that weren't codified yet. These aren't primitive frontier buildings. These are mature applications of advanced engineering knowledge, which raises the question nobody seems willing to ask directly. If 19th century builders were working with inherited technology, following design templates they didn't fully understand, completing structures whose original purpose had been lost, where did those templates come from? The maps from the period show something labelled Tartaria, occupying vast territories across Asia and Eastern Europe. Not a small region, not a minor footnote, a massive presence that supposedly vanished from history within a single generation, leaving behind only architectural echoes and buried cities nobody wants to explain. What happened to that massive presence? The standard explanation is that Tartaria was simply a cartographic placeholder, a name applied to poorly mapped regions of Asia, nothing more than geographic shorthand for terra incognita. But that explanation collapses when you examine the specificity of the maps. These weren't vague sketches of unknown lands. They showed cities, trade routes, political boundaries, infrastructure networks. The level of detail suggests direct knowledge, not speculation about unexplored territory, and then it disappears, not gradually fading from maps as better information became available. Abruptly, within decades, Tartaria vanishes from cartography entirely, replaced by the current political designations we recognize today. No transition period, no explanation in geographic literature of the time, just erasure. The architecture tells a parallel story. Examine buildings constructed during this transition period. They show two distinct phases. First, sophisticated structures with the engineering characteristics I've described. Then simpler buildings using demonstrably less advanced techniques, not evolution, devolution, as if the knowledge base supporting the earlier construction suddenly became unavailable. This happens worldwide, simultaneously. Cities in North America, Europe, Asia, all showing the same architectural regression within the same time window. The conventional narrative attributes this to changing aesthetic preferences, economic constraints, industrialization's impact on construction methods. But those explanations require gradual transitions, regional variations, experimental phases. You don't see any of that. You see abrupt change, universal adoption of simpler methods, loss of capabilities that were being routinely applied just years earlier. The photographic record is particularly revealing. Early photographs of major cities show architectural density and sophistication that seems anachronistic. Buildings that shouldn't exist yet according to standard development timelines. Infrastructure that appears complete in images predating the supposed construction dates by decades. And in many cases, these same structures appear at different ground levels in photographs taken just 20 years apart. I found an image of San Francisco from 1856. The city appears fully developed, with substantial stone buildings, organized streets, sophisticated infrastructure. According to official history, San Francisco was barely more than a gold rush settlement at this point, mostly wooden structures thrown up hastily. But the photograph shows something else entirely: permanent architecture, engineered systems, urban planning that suggests generations of development, not a decade of improvisation. Similar patterns appear in photographs of Melbourne, Denver, Buenos Aires, cities supposedly in their infancy, showing architectural maturity that doesn't match the timeline. And buried beneath modern street levels, the evidence of even earlier development that official chronologies simply ignore. The question becomes unavoidable. What if the timeline itself is wrong? Not slightly off, not requiring minor adjustments, fundamentally incorrect? What if these cities weren't built in the 19th century, but inherited? What if the construction we attribute to Victorian ingenuity was actually reconstruction, adaptation of existing structures, repurposing of buildings whose original builders had vanished? That framework explains what conventional history cannot. It explains the buried architecture, the uniform sophistication, the sudden appearance of mature construction techniques, the coordinated street raising across continents, the missing documentation, the architectural regression, the cartographic erasure of Tartaria. Consider what this implies. The buildings we walk past daily, the infrastructure we assume represents 19th century industrial achievement, might actually be remnants of something older. Structures we've been occupying, modifying, burying, without understanding their origin or original purpose, living in the ruins without recognizing them as ruins. The heating systems are particularly telling. Many older buildings contain elaborate networks of air ducts and thermal distribution channels running through walls, under floors, connecting to central heating sources that no longer exist. The official explanation calls these early experiments in central heating, but the sophistication suggests otherwise. These aren't experimental systems. These are mature technologies implemented at scale, then lost. I traced the heating infrastructure in one Chicago building. The ductwork runs through structural walls, meaning it was integrated during original construction, not added later. The engineering shows understanding of thermodynamics, air pressure, convection principles supposedly not applied to building systems until the early 20th century. Yet this building's official construction date is 1871. The math doesn't work unless the technology was inherited, not invented. The same pattern appears in acoustic design. Concert halls and theatres from the period demonstrate sound engineering that modern architects struggle to replicate. Wall angles calculated for precise reflection patterns, ceiling shapes optimized for specific resonance frequencies, material choices that enhance particular tonal ranges. All of this appearing in buildings constructed by people who supposedly had no formal training in acoustics. Unless they were working from existing templates, following design principles they'd inherited without fully understanding the underlying physics. Which brings us back to burial. Why would you bury functional architecture? Why would you deliberately entomb sophisticated infrastructure? The standard explanations about sanitation and flood control don't withstand scrutiny. You don't bury ornate public entrances to improve drainage. You don't cover elaborate stonework because streets needed raising a few meters, unless the burial served a different purpose entirely. Unless it was concealment, not improvement. Unless someone wanted to obscure evidence of what came before, to establish a new chronology, to begin history fresh from a convenient starting point. Look at what happened after the supposed burial. Within a generation, architectural knowledge degraded. Buildings constructed in the 1890s show demonstrably less sophistication than those from the 1870s. Not improvement through innovation, regression, loss of capability, as if the builders who created the buried structures disappeared, leaving behind people who could maintain and modify but not replicate. The stone cutting is the clearest indicator. Buildings dated to the 1860s and 1870s feature precisely cut blocks with joints so tight you can't insert paper between them. By the 1890s, the same cities are producing rougher stonework, wider joints, less sophisticated structural systems. That's backwards. Technology should improve. Knowledge should accumulate. Instead, we see decline masked as progress. Unless what we call the Victorian construction boom was actually salvage operation. Not building from scratch, but adapting, repairing, completing structures that already existed in various states of finish. That would explain the inconsistency, why some buildings show incredible sophistication, while others from the same period appear crude, why architectural knowledge seems to peak then fade, why documentation focuses on renovation and completion rather than original design. The maps provide the timeline. Tartaria appears on cartographic records through the early 1800s, then it begins disappearing, not conquered in documented wars, not absorbed through recorded political processes, just erased, first from new maps, then from updated editions of existing atlases. By 1900 it's gone completely, replaced by political boundaries that supposedly always existed. That's not how geography works. That's not how cartographic conventions evolve. Names persist for centuries after political entities collapse. We still use Roman provincial names. We reference historical kingdoms long dissolved. Geographic designations outlast the civilizations that created them, unless the erasure was deliberate. Unless someone with authority over cartographic standards decided Tartaria should cease to exist in the official record. Not because the geography changed, but because the narrative changed. Because acknowledging Tartaria's existence raised questions about the buildings, about the technology, about who actually built the cities we attribute to Victorian industry. I found something in a Chicago municipal archive that shouldn't exist. A construction contract from 1872 for work on a building the official records claim was built entirely in 1873. The contract describes renovation and completion, not new construction. It references existing foundations, structural walls already in place, heating systems requiring connection to new distribution networks. The language treats the building as partially finished, not as empty lot. That single document contradicts the entire official chronology for that structure. And it's not unique. Similar contracts exist for buildings across the city, all describing completion and adaptation rather than original construction. As if Chicago in the 1870s was filled with partially finished buildings waiting for occupants who would claim to have built them. The same pattern appears in census records. Population figures for Western American cities jump impossibly between decades. Not steady growth, not immigration patterns that match ship manifests and border crossings. Sudden appearance of populations that official history can't adequately source. Unless the cities were already there, already populated, and the census simply began counting people who'd been present all along. This is where the investigation becomes impossible to dismiss, because we're not talking about speculation anymore. We're talking about documents, photographs, physical structures you can visit and examine. Evidence that exists in official archives but doesn't fit official explanations. The buildings know what happened. Their foundations extend deeper than any practical purpose requires, down to ground levels that were street level before the burial. Their architecture tells a story of sophisticated urban planning implemented at scale. Their engineering demonstrates capabilities that shouldn't exist in the supposed era of construction. Walk through any city centre built before 1900. Look down, not up. Notice how the buildings sit in the ground, how the basement windows show architectural detail that surpasses most modern construction, how the buried levels feel like they were meant to be seen, experienced, occupied as primary spaces. Then ask yourself what else we're walking on top of. What other evidence lies buried beneath raised streets and revised timelines? What other civilizations have been erased from the record, their achievements attributed to people who came after, their technology dismissed as primitive experimentation. The answer matters because it changes everything we think we know about human progress, about who we are and where we came from, about whether our civilization represents the apex of achievement or merely one point along a cycle that has repeated before. Tartaria isn't the only name that disappeared from maps. It's just the most obvious, the most recent, the one we can still trace through documented cartographic evolution. How many others vanished earlier, more completely, leaving behind only the buildings we no longer recognize as inheritance? The buried windows are everywhere. The evidence is visible. The pattern is undeniable. What we choose to see, what we're willing to question, that determines whether we remain comfortable in incomplete narratives or pursue understanding wherever it leads. Even when it leads underground, into foundations we didn't build, beneath cities we didn't create, walking on history we've been taught to forget. The cities remember even if we've chosen to forget. Every buried window, every entombed archway, every foundation extending impossibly deep into earth that wasn't there before stands as testament to something we're not supposed to see. You can verify this yourself. The photographs exist in public archives. The buildings stand on every downtown block. The engineering speaks for itself if you're willing to listen. What we've inherited isn't progress from primitive origins. It's recovery from something more sophisticated that we've been occupying without understanding. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed. The question is what else lies beneath the street level of accepted history, waiting for someone to look down instead of forward.